Okay, here we are with the immune system. This is one of the ones I really like to teach, but they have taken it almost completely out of the AP syllabus, and the IB syllabus really doesn't delve in very deep. So in class, I'm going to do a fair bit more than what this video shows. I'm just going to focus on the AP, the little bit of AP stuff and the IB syllabus things here. So here we go. So this says a lot. A whole bunch of the questions you get are going to really revolve around this little graph here. So we have these keywords, non-specific. I know you can't read that because it's red, and specific. And these now have been replaced. The mechanisms, the players, and the things that they do, like white blood cells and this and that, the mechanisms and the players and what they do have been replaced by the terms innate and acquired immune systems. And what immune means, and why this one in this graphic is the only one that's called immune, is that this system is going to make you immune to this particular disease. And so in the old days, they only used the word immune to describe these players and the kind of mechanisms that they did. But now we use the word immune to refer to the innate immune defenses. We'll call them that. Okay. So here we see they also have this first line, second line, third line. That's a little misleading because all of these players are acting at the same time. They don't have one finish and the other waits till they finish and da-da-da-da. So your first line of defense is your exterior. Most bad guys can't get through your skin or your mucous membranes, what I call your inner skin, like the inside of your cheek, right? If you put your finger right in your mouth and touch the inside of your cheek, you're touching a mucous membrane. And then if you just took your hand and went all the way down through your stomach and intestines and things, don't do that at home. Those would be mucous membranes. The lining of your lungs are also mucous membranes because they have cells that secrete mucus. And then besides mucus, they secrete a whole bunch of other chemicals, but hardly any of those made the list in either AP or IB. So you also have a defense system that involves white blood cells. Those are also known as leukocytes. Leuko is, I think, Greek for white. So all white blood cells are called leukocytes. Red ones are erythrocytes. That's a red word, erythro. So all of them are leukocytes, but we're going to mostly focus on a type of leukocyte, a subclass of leukocytes called lymphocytes, because they're the ones that have to do with this system that really makes you immune and makes antibodies and things like that. Okay, there's a bunch of other proteins involved here, and then a response called the inflammatory response. That's a key response. But what is again true of, now it's going to get messy, what is again true of like these two boxes and these defenses, they are non-specific. That means that it doesn't matter what the bad guy is, these will offer some defense against it. Whereas over here, you have players, these lymphocytes, and molecules they make, antibodies, that are going to be quite specific. Your body launches a defense against a specific flu virus and leaves you immune to that specific flu virus, right? But there's lots of viruses that cause what we call the flu, and that's why you can get the flu again and again and again, and it seems like you're not immune to it. So here's the words innate and acquired, right? Lots of invertebrates like cockroaches share much of the innate defenses, which shouldn't surprise you, right? Common ancestry kind of idea. But the kind we're going to focus on mostly, the ones with the lymphocyte kind of white blood cells, that's only a vertebrate thing. Cockroaches don't do that. So integument is another word for skin and mucous membrane stuff. And so here again, I'll remind you that if you see it in red ink, that is an IB that everybody needs to know. That's an SL level IB. Here is an AP objective. I didn't make them a particular color here. But this is an old AP objective. This is no longer, they took all the human systems out except as they apply for examples of certain kinds of basic principles, and we'll come up to one of those in a little bit. So, once again, a reminder that the language of the syllabus, here again in red, is going to also be the language of the test. So when they use the word lymphocyte, they expect you to know what lymphocyte is, memory cells, right? So one of the things that these white blood cells, all of them do, is they eat by phagocytosis, by engulfing things. That's how they get their nutrition, right? This little highlighted in yellow blurb says subgroups of phagocyte and lymphocytes are not required. So up here it tells you that the white blood cell, the phagocytic leukocyte white blood cell called neutrophils, they make up most of them. Most of your white blood cells are of this kind, but this tells you you don't need to know that subgroup. However, in the higher level stuff we're going to see in a little bit, they are going to ask you to differentiate between some subgroups of lymphocytes, specifically the T and the B cells. So here we go. But students should be aware that some lymphocytes act as memory cells. These are the heart and soul of immunity, being immune. They also tell you here, and we're going to get to this later, that these lymphocytes can quickly reproduce to form a clone. What does that mean? Exact genetic copy, right? They're going to reproduce by mitosis, so we got that going on, of plasma cells. Plasma cells are the kind of lymphocyte that are also known as B cells. They're the ones that make antibodies. So I'm going to get to that more in a little bit, so I'm moving on. Okay, the macrophages. This name didn't show up anywhere, but it really should have in the IB syllabus. So it's a subgroup that they said they're not going to ask you about. However, they can always tell you a story about these and expect you to apply principles. So these are big, as their name suggests, and what is unique about them is that they are involved in both the innate and the acquired immune systems. They cross the line, so to speak. They gobble up bad guys. Here you see them gobbling up bacteria cells. Those are all bacteria cells. And this is a white blood cell, a macrophage, having lunch. Okay, so they don't mention your lymphatic system, but it's a key part. Basically, wherever you have veins and arteries running, you very often have another kind of vessel that doesn't carry what we call blood, but carries what we call lymph, therefore the lymphatic system. And in that lymph is no red blood cells, but a good many white blood cells. So even though we don't call it our circulatory system, it is a circulatory system, and it does have blood cells in it, just not red blood cells. And there are at certain places these enlargements called lymph nodes. You're familiar with some of those under your neck, under your arm, in the groin area. You have patches of those. And if you can see, it's kind of like a maze. If a bad guy, a pathogen comes in here, it's going to bump against lots of walls before it makes its way out. And that makes it more likely that it bumps into one of these lymphocyte white blood cells that's going to help defend against it. So there's a kind of white blood cell called natural killer cells that sounds like they kill the bad guy, but they don't. They kill your own cells that have become infected by viruses. What's the good part of that? So that cell doesn't make any more viruses, because remember, that's what viruses do. They use your cells to make more of themselves. But also, they can kill your own cells that have become cancerous. So I'm going to come back to them in just a little bit. They didn't make it anywhere on the list. They are fairly non-specific in terms of this virus-infected body cell can be infected by any kind of virus, and a natural killer cell will kill it. So now we hit the inflammatory response, and while that term didn't make the syllabus anywhere, this did. Clotting factors is part of the inflammatory response, and so is histamine. That's coming up soon, all right, and on the next slide, I think. But this made it, and I touch on this in the circulatory system too. These clotting factors, platelets, are little like pieces of blood cells, literally pieces of blood cells, but chemistry happens in there, including the chemistry making these clotting factors. So here's the histamine thing. Certain white cells, and I name them up here, but you don't need to know specifically that, certain white cells release this chemical called histamine in response to allergens or any kind of damage. They chose to focus, I'm not sure why, they meaning the IB people, and this purple, remember, this purple is the higher level stuff. When you see the purple, that means if you're taking the higher level test, you need to know this part, right? What histamines do is they cause capillaries in the area of the damage to dilate. What's that mean? Get a little bigger, a little wider. That lets more fluid come to that area, but they also, histamine causes them to be more permeable so that some of that fluid comes out. And it also lets the white blood cells come out to that area of damage so they can fight the things that are causing the damage. But it's histamine that gives you a runny nose, all that fluid coming out, when what's being infected is your upper respiratory tract and your eyes maybe. And that's why you might take an antihistamine if you want to cut off that runny nose stuff. But you realize antihistamines, when you take them, are kind of fighting against your body's attempt to defeat this bad guy, which involves the use of histamines. So what are allergens, real fast, since they put it here? Allergens are things which aren't bad guys, but your body responds to them as if they're bad guys. Things like a pollen grain, probably the most common allergen, right? Cat hair, dog hair. Your body responds to them as if they're bad guys, so you get all these kind of things triggered as if you had a bad guy attacking you, the runny nose and the inflammation and stuff like that. That's an allergy. Okay, so I threw this in here because this inflammatory response and the fluids that are now coming out of capillaries much more easily, if there's too much of that, a little bit's a good thing, but if there's too much of that, it causes extremely low blood pressure, which eventually can kill you. This is what shock is. This shock that's due to infection, sepsis is an infection word. This shock called septic shock is, as you can see, the most common cause of death in U.S. critical care units. And sometimes, unfortunately, you get that infecting agent in the hospital. They're hard to control. Well, now this is what we've learned that this virus called COVID can do. It can elicit what's called a cytokine storm. You might have heard of that, right? Which is massive inflammation. What are cytokines? They're signal molecules. They say, do this inflammation. And COVID can infect some cells that release massive amounts of these cytokines, a cytokine storm, and they cause massive amounts of the inflammatory response, including lots of histamine out, which because your bloodstream, your circulatory system now loses a lot of the fluid that's in it, causes very, very low blood pressure, and that eventually sometimes can shut your brain off. Okay, so here we have a note here. Again, this is a everybody needs to know red ink kind of thing. Here's another chemical that's a protein that works against virus-infected cells. They don't talk about it in either syllabus, so I put it on here only to tie this in, right? Interferons work against viral infection. They don't do anything against bacteria. Antibiotics, which we've studied a fair bit, only work against bacteria. So they don't do anything for a viral infection. So they want you to know that here. Viruses lack the metabolism that antibiotics can interfere with. Therefore, antibiotics can't treat viral problems, right? And then they remind you the evolutionary thing. Many strains of bacteria have evolved resistance to antibiotics, some of them multiple resistance, okay? So what makes antibiotics so effective, they also put this specifically, need to know, is that they can block physiological processes, cellular chemistry processes that occur in prokaryotic cells, like the building of that unique prokaryotic cell wall, which you don't find in any eukaryotic cells. Therefore, this medicine is like a magic bullet that can only affect these kind of cells and not those.